Hello ladies and gentlemen, in this opportunity we want to present our paper with the title is Standard Index Analysis of Air Pollution of DKI Jakarta Province using Cluster Methods. Let me introduce ourselves. I am Adinda Hita Saraswati with my friends Latifa Susilowat and Rizky Wahyuningtia, and our lecturers Mr. Dr. Isnander Slamet MSc, PhD, and Ms. Kiki Ferawati, SSI, MStat. We are from Department of Statistics, Sebelas Maret University. First, we go to the introduction. Jakarta, as the capital city of Indonesia, has around 10.7 million inhabitants in 2020. With such a large population, there will be a lot of environmental pollution, one of which is air pollution as an impact of fulfilling needs by the citizen. Air pollution increases the number of health risks, such as pulmonary and cardiovascular disease, including heart attack and stroke, and then cancer and diabetes. One method that can be applied in this problem is the clustering method. The object will be grouped into several groups so that objects that have similarities with others will be in one group. The purpose of this study was to obtain the results of the cluster formed by the clustering method in the analysis of the Air Pollution Standard Index of DKI Jakarta Province in 2020. Expected result of the study can be used as a reference for DKI Jakarta government in taking appropriate policies in order to optimally tackle the problem of air pollution in related areas. Next, we go to the theoretical basis. The first, air pollution. Air pollution is the entry of mixing of harmful elements into the atmosphere, which can cause environmental damage, thereby reducing environmental quality. There are two types of air pollution source. The first is pollution due to natural source such as volcanic eruption, and the second comes from the human activities. Air Pollution Standard Index. The Air Quality Standard Index that is officially used in Indonesia is the Air Pollution Standard Index or Index Standar Pencemaran Udara or ISPU. This is in accordance with the decree of the State Minister of the Environment number 45, year 1997 about the Air Pollutant Standard Index. In this decision, the consideration used include that in order to provide convenience of uniformity of ambient air quality information to the public at a certain location and the time, and as a material consideration in carrying out air pollution control efforts. And then pre-processing data. Pre-processing data is one of the early stage in data mining, which aims to make the data used for data mining application, and it can be easily interpreted for analysis. The stages are check and resolve missing values, check and resolve the outliers, do transformation if needed, and do feature selection if needed. Cluster analysis is the statistical analysis that can be used to group the data or objects based on the similarity of the characteristics of the analyzed variables. This cluster analysis is classified into two methods, namely hierarchical methods and non-hierarchical methods. The hierarchical methods consist of several methods, such as single linkage, complete linkage, and average linkage. Next, we talk about hierarchical method. The first, we talk about single linkage. This method uses the principle of minimum distance, which begins with finding two objects that have the closest distance. The two form the first group. In the next step, there are two possibilities, namely the third object will join the first group, and the other two objects will form the new group. This process will continue until finally the single group is formed in this method. The distance between groups is defined as the closest distance between each member. And then complete linkage. This method is the opposite of the approach used in single linkage. The first principle used is the maximum distance. Before, the single linkage used a minimum distance, but in this complete linkage use a maximum distance. The distance between one cluster and another is measured based on the object that has the farthest distance. And then average linkage. This method follows the same procedure as the previous two methods. The principle of distance measurement used is the average distance between each possible pair of objects. Next, we talk about non-hierarchical method. In this paper, we use K-means method. K-means is one method that is often used for grouping. The K-means method is included in the non-hierarchical clustering method, which has a vast computation time. Therefore, this method is very popular and often used.
3. Research methods. Data search. The source of data in this study was obtained from the official website of the local government of Jakarta, which was published on the Open Data Jakarta data website. The data used in secondary data regarding the Air Pollution Standard Index (ISPU) of DKI Jakarta Province during 2020 from 5 air quality monitoring stations SPKU, namely DKI 1 Bundaran HI, DKI 2 Kelapa Gading, DKI 3 Jagakarsa, DKI 4 Lubang Buaya, and DKI 5 Jakarta Barat. Research variable. The variables used in this study are variables that affect the standard index of air pollution, namely PM10, particulate matter, SO2, sulfate, CO, carbon monoxide, O3, ozone, and NO2, nitrogen dioxide. Analysis step. The following are the steps of the analysis carried out in this study. First, perform descriptive analysis on the data. Then perform data pre-processing, then perform cluster analysis using hierarchical and non-hierarchical methods. Finally, draw a conclusion. For discussion, descriptive statistics. Descriptive statistics are carried out to provide an overview of the characteristics of each research variable as seen from the average mean, the lowest value minimum, the highest value maximum, and the median value median. The following descriptive statistics from the data are presented in Table 1. After obtaining descriptive statistics, then the pre-processing stage will be carried out on the data to be used. Pre-processing data. The first step is to detect the missing value symbolized by NA. In the previous descriptive statistic, it can be seen that all variables have missing values. If the data has a missing value, it must be treated with imputation with a mean or median value depending on the distribution of the data. On figures 1a to 1e, it can be seen that all variables tend to have a skewness distribution. So the imputation treatment uses the median value of each variable. The next pre-processing step is outlier detection using box plot. From figures 2a to 2e, it can be seen that all variables have outliers. The outliers are left and not removed. This is done so that the authenticity of the data is maintained and does not change. The next pre-processing step is checking the data range to see whether or not it is necessary to transform the data. The data used doesn't have a large data range, so that the transformation step doesn't need to be applied to this data. The last step, namely feature selection, is not applied to this data because all the variables used are important variables and affect their pollution standard index. After pre-processing the data is clean and ready to be used for further analysis. Descriptive statistics of clean data from pre-processing results are shown in Table 2. Hierarchical method. Single linkage method key optimum results using the Susilowat method for the single linkage method. Based on the figure G, the optimum K is 2. The result of the cluster using the single linkage method with two clusters are shown in figure 4. Based on table 4, it can be seen that the average of the SO2, O3, and NO2 variables is higher in cluster 2 than in cluster 1. Therefore, cluster 1 is a low cluster category, good ISPU, while cluster 2 is a high cluster category, unhealthy ISPU. In addition to the average of the variables, the cooperative correlation coefficient is also obtained. The single linkage method has a cooperative correlation coefficient of 0.81666564.
And the second one is complete linkage method. So figure 5 is the I-CMME value of complete linkage method using the Susilowat method. So based on figure 5 in the previous, the optimum K is 2. The results of the cluster using the complete linkage method with two clusters are shown in figure 6. So this figure 6 is the dendrogram of complete linkage with K is 2. And in table 5, there is the member of each of the cluster of the complete linkage method. And there is table 6, the characteristics of each complete linkage cluster. So based on this table, it can be seen that the average of the PM10, SO2, CO, and NO2 is higher in cluster 2 than in cluster 1. And for the O3, it has a lower average in cluster 2 than in cluster 1. So therefore, cluster 1 is a low cluster category or is a good ISPU, while cluster 2 is a high cluster category or is an unhealthy ISPU. And there is the cooperative correlation coefficient of the complete linkage method is 0.758081. So that is the cooperative correlation coefficient of the complete linkage method. And now there is the third hierarchical method is average linkage method. Figure 7 is the K optimum value of average linkage method using the Susilowat method. And based on figure 7 in the previous, the optimum K is obtained by 2. So the results of the cluster using the average linkage method with two clusters are shown in figure 8. So that figure 8 is the dendrogram of average linkage method with K is 2. And there is table 7. Table 7 is the average linkage method cluster members. So that is the members of each cluster of average linkage method. And then there is table 8 on the lower section. That is the characteristics of average linkage cluster. And in this table, it can be seen that the average of PM10, SO2, CO, and NO2 is higher in cluster 2 than in cluster 1, and for O3 it's lower in cluster 2 and higher in cluster 1. Therefore, for cluster 1, it is a low cluster category or is a good ISPU, while in cluster 2 it is a high cluster category or is an unhealthy ISPU. And for the Copenhagen correlation coefficient of the average linkage method is 0.8448385. And now is the comparison of hierarchical method. So we compare the three methods: simple linkage, complete linkage, and average linkage. A good cluster method is a method that has a Copenhagen correlation coefficient close to 1. So the Copenhagen correlation coefficient of each hierarchical method are shown in table 9. That is the table 9, and that is each of the Copenhagen correlation coefficient of each of the method. So based on the table 9, the closest method to 1, the coefficient, the closest one to 1 is the average linkage method. Therefore, in this hierarchical method, the best method is the average linkage method. And now we come to non-hierarchical method. The one that we choose is k-means method. So in figure 9, that is the k-optimum value of k-means method using the Susilowat method. And based on figure 9 in the previous, the optimum k is obtained by 2. So that the cluster is divided on 2 clusters. So the results of the cluster using the k-means method with 2 clusters are shown in figure 10. So that is the figure 10. The k-means cluster results with k is 2. So the previous figure, or figure 10, is the result of a cluster using the k-means method with k is 2, and it can be seen that each air pollution standard index has been well divided into 2 groups, and the number of each cluster is shown in table 10. So in table 10 there is the 2 cluster and the cluster member and the number of the number of the members. So in cluster 1 there is 1673 members, and in cluster 2 there is 148 members. The characteristics of each cluster are seen from the average of each variable in each cluster. So the characteristics of each cluster will be shown in table 10. In this table, it can be seen that the average of PM10, SO2, CO, and NO2 is higher in cluster 2 than in cluster 1, and for O3, it is lower in cluster 2 and it is higher in cluster 1. So therefore, cluster 1 is a low cluster category, or it is a good ISPU, while cluster 2 is a high cluster category, or it is an unhealthy ISPU. And now we're going to see the clustering results with hierarchical method and non-hierarchical method. So this is the results. For the hierarchical method, we have average linkage, and for the non-hierarchical method, we have k-means. And the pink one, the bold one, is for cluster 1, and the younger color of pink is cluster 2. So this figure 11 shows the number of members of each cluster in the average linkage and k-means method. So in average linkage, we have cluster 1 is 1675 members, and for cluster 1, and 146 for cluster 2. And for k-means, it has 1673 members for cluster 1 and 148 members for cluster 2. And now we come to the conclusions of this paper. So based on the results of the discussion in the previous, the classification of the air pollution standard index, or we said ISPU, in DKI Jakarta in 2020 with the hierarchical method. single linkage, complete linkage, and average linkage, and the non-hierarchical method is K-means, is divided into two clusters. The best method for classifying ISPU in DKI Jakarta in 2020 is the K-means method. In the K-means method, Cluster 1 as a cluster with a good ISPU has 1,673 members, while Cluster 2 as a cluster with an unhealthy ISPU has 148 members. So that's all for our presentation. Thank you for your attention.